Hey y'all, today I wanted to talk about why we worship Dionysus, especially from the perspective of myself, someone who is a pagan witch and also has a degree in classics.
I bite at the hand that feeds me, slap at the face that eats me, some kind of animal, cannibal.
Now, when I say I have a degree in classics, I mean I'm about a semester away. I am in the last week or so of my first semester of my senior year, and then I have my next semester, and then I have my degree. Actually, today I have my first of 2 capstones, and I just finished writing a very big research paper on the Apollonian and Dionysian tendencies, largely analyzing a book called The Bacchae by a guy called Euripides. So the Bacchae is a Greek tragedy written by Euripides, who is the third of the great tragedians. He would have been writing around the 5th century BCE. It is also his Bacchae that is the key text that scholars analyze to understand anything about the cult of Dionysus, because the secrecy of the cult of Dionysus was pretty intrinsic to their practices, and so we really have very little information on the cult itself. Now, what do you think of when you think of Dionysus? You probably think of wine, partying, a bit of hedonism, but this is really only part of the case. Of course, Dionysus's worship and epithets vary significantly, but the essence of it is frenzy. It's finding the middle ground. It's marrying things that seem like opposites. Honestly, Dionysus is very chaotic. In fact, his probably most infamous epithet is Dionysus Bacchos, which is the one that I have his candle dedicated to at the moment. Bacchos means frenzied Dionysus. And Bacchos is actually the epithet that informs the naming of the god in Roman religion, Bacchus. Now let's start with sort of the history of the god. While we have linear bead tablets, which are some of the oldest texts from ancient Greeks that display worship and reverence of Dionysus, he is introduced in Euripides as a new god to Thebes, showing that Dionysus is this eternal foreigner, even though he is one of the oldest gods in the Greek pantheon, at least when we're looking from a purely secular historical point of view. What's also really unique about the cult of Dionysus is the way that it encourages women to abandon their earthly roles of wife, mothers, daughters, to join the cult of Dionysus, to become a collective of frenzied individuals. Now, something that I found really fascinating about this is that if you have a god of frenzy, a god who is so antithetical to structure that he takes things like life and death and he blurs the line, nature and society and he blurs the lines, he's an eternal foreigner, but he's also one of the oldest worshipped Greek gods, and he even has a very feminine appearance even though he is a man. What is a god like that doing in ancient Greece, a society that so heavily values order and structure, law, politics, and wisdom? What is that all about? Now, I hate to say it, but to understand this, we kind of have to look at Nietzsche. Yes, the favorite philosopher of 19-year-old edgy boys. Nietzsche was actually a classicist early in his career. At the university he worked at, he was the youngest employed professor, and he honestly seemed to be a prodigy in the field until the release of his book, The Birth of Tragedy, which did not go over well, but is largely valued by scholars today. I honestly think this is because this work was deconstructive in a way that was ahead of its time. There are some things from the book that I'm not a huge fan of. However, the idea of an Apollonian and Dionysian divide is actually probably one of the most important contributions that has ever been made to the study of Apollo and Dionysus within Greek religion. And this is something that Nietzsche outlines in his book, The Birth of Tragedy, where the Apollonian is the tendency towards structure, politics, the rule of law, high art forms such as speech, oration, poetry. The Dionysian is the tendency towards the frenzied, drunkenness, and music. And it should not be lost on us that Dionysus's cult really centers women. And what is that about? We know that in ancient Greece, there was a lot of cult activity that heavily centered women. In fact, it was one of the few places in which women had a lot of power. However, as sophistry began to gain popularity, which is a completely different topic, but essentially sophistry has a tendency to value what is illogical over anything else, including religion. And don't get me wrong, I think sophists are pretty cool. But there is no doubt that they unfortunately had a significant role to play in some of the devaluing of religious institutions in the ancient world. Now let's get into the plot of Euripides' Bacchae. Dionysus seeks revenge after his mother had been ridiculed and unalived for her lie about sleeping with Zeus and conceiving Dionysus. She had been a woman of Thebes, and Thebes was the people that ridiculed her. So he decides that he is going to prove himself to be a real god to the Theban people who believe that he died when Zeus shot the lightning bolt at his mother. He's going to prove himself. He's going to prove that he's real, that he exists, and he demands worship just as much as any of the other gods. So he goes to Thebes in disguise as a priest of himself, a priest whose appearance is described as very foreign and lacking masculinity in a sort of traditional Greek way. It's also worth noting that he comes with his already preset group of Bacchae, and some translations will refer to them as the Asian Bacchae. This is because, once again, there is this part of his mythology of him being a foreigner, that his following, his worship is somehow foreign but also intrinsic to Greece. Like I said, he blurs lines. He also gets many of the women of Thebes to join the Bacchae, including the current king, King Pentheus's mother, Agave. Pentheus is rigidly against this. He first of all doesn't believe Dionysus is a real god. He even accuses the Bacchae themselves of actually secretly worshiping Aphrodite and using the excuse of this new god to do so, because they are not following standards of propriety that are set in ancient Greece for women. They are engaging freely in sexuality, they are drinking, they are living in the wood. They're even described as wearing animal skins and holding thyrsuses and even being able to rip animals apart with their brute strength. Now, though the real life Bacchae probably were not able to rip animals apart with their brute strength or anything else really, this is really important because, well, it represents one of the deep-seated fears that men in ancient Greece have. See, sexuality is a really big area of anxiety for ancient Greek men, contrary to popular belief. We in the modern day like to think that just because ancient Greek people were allowed to sleep with people of their same sex, that means that they were somehow freer. But the truth is that there was still heavily stringent sexual regulation in ancient Greece. For men, it demonstrated their virtue if they were able to restrain themselves quite significantly, because it was believed that they had dominion over all of their potential sexual exploits, including women, boys, and slaves. And women's adherence to their own sexual restriction was also a point of virtue and value for them. Men also often feared the reproductive capacity of women, and they did not understand it on a scientific level the way we do at all. In the Oresteia, which is another Greek tragedy, you have Apollo literally saying that, well, actually the power of birth belongs to the man, and that a woman is essentially just a garden for a man's seed to grow. Now, the Oresteia and Apollo are kind of a completely different topic. I know we talked a little bit about the Apollonian in this video, and it will probably come up again, but this video is mostly centered on Dionysus, so we'll keep it there for now. But just know that there is an association between the Apollonian and patriarchy in ancient Greece. Now, in my own personal worship and practice, I do kind of ignore this a little bit because I do love Apollo, but the ancient Greeks were people like any other. And so, of course, they projected their own ideas about misogyny and what the rule of law contained onto the gods. I have a whole other video on mythic literalism if you're interested. And so the patriarchy really does subsist on taking autonomy away from women in a lot of ways. Autonomy over their own bodies, over their own children. The rule of law doesn't give any of that to them even, but does expect them to be wives and mothers. So therein lies what Dionysian worship does for society. Dionysian worship allows people, particularly a woman, a social safety valve, a sort of outlet for their frustration, anger, sexuality, frenziness, wanting to party. And Euripides concludes his story by having Pentheus, who refuses to accept Dionysus, be murdered by his own mother Agave in her Bacchic frenzy. Euripides is making a very clear point, and it's that you gotta leave the women alone. You gotta let them have their religious practice. Now, many other of Euripides' work do focus a lot on women. They talk a lot about the strife that ancient Greek women are put through. And we could talk about Medea in another video, but she has a whole rant about the unfair social expectations of Greek women that are honestly insane to her as a foreign woman. And was Euripides probably a misogynist by modern standards? Definitely. But was he way ahead of his time in terms of bringing women's issues to the forefront of the stage at the Dionysia? Yeah, he was. Now, the Dionysia is actually a festival in which Greek tragedy is put on. Each tragedian submits 3 plays for the tragedy and a satyr play, which is kind of like a humorous play about satyrs at the end. Dionysus is a god of frenzy, sexuality, wine, drunkenness, the merging of things that are seemingly opposite. And that's something I find particularly powerful and useful as a modern witch who often finds herself having to reconcile what is considered fact with what is not considered fact, because our world still believes that the science and the spiritual cannot coexist together. And as we can see here, Dionysus is so much more than simply a god of wine and drunkenness. I did mention those as part of it, but they're not the whole picture. He's ultimately a god of catharsis. And that's what makes Dionysus so wonderful to me. I'd be happy to talk more specifically about Dionysian worship in another video. This was supposed to be a short, sweet little discussion of why Dionysian worship is what it is. That's gonna be all for me though, and I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a great rest of your time. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.